Welcome back, mystery enthusiasts. Today's case will challenge everything you think you know about impossible crimes. I'm about to take you into the mind of the world's greatest detective as he faces a mystery that nearly broke his legendary powers of deduction. Picture this, a fog-drenched October morning in London, 1891. The muffled sounds of carriage wheels on cobblestones echo through Baker Street as an urgent knocking breaks the dawn silence. The scent of coal smoke mingles with something else, something that shouldn't be there at this hour. But here's where it gets impossible. A renowned botanist found dead in his locked study, surrounded by exotic plants that shouldn't bloom in England's autumn. No visible cause of death. A room that smells of tropical flowers despite windows sealed for winter. And Holmes, the man who never misses anything, almost overlooked the one clue that would crack the case wide open. What was this clue? How did it change everything? And why did Holmes himself admit this case pushed his methods to their absolute limit? I'm going to reveal something shocking. The killer used a method so ingenious that even Scotland Yard declared it impossible. But Holmes found the truth hidden in plain sight, in a single petal that belonged to no plant in that room. Before we dive into this incredible investigation, make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell, because what you're about to discover will change how you look at every Sherlock Holmes case forever. The victim, a respected botanist with secrets darker than London fog. The scene, a locked room that defied every rule of logic. The method, so brilliant it nearly fooled the world's greatest detective. Are you ready to walk through the evidence alongside Holmes himself? To see how one overlooked detail unraveled an entire web of deception? Then settle in, because this hour-long investigation will keep you guessing until the very last second. Let's begin where every great mystery should, with the impossible made possible through the power of deduction. The urgent pounding on the door of 221B Baker Street came at precisely 6:47 a.m. Mrs. Hudson's frustrated voice carried up the stairs. "Mr. Holmes, there's a lady here says it's a matter of life and death." Holmes, already dressed despite the early hour, descended to find Mrs. Charlotte Pemberton standing in their parlor. Her black mourning dress spoke of recent loss, but her nervously twisting wedding ring revealed deeper anxieties than simple grief. "Mr. Holmes," she began, her voice measured but trembling, "they say my husband's death was natural. The police, the coroner, they all insist there's nothing suspicious. But I know something terrible happened in that room." Watson observed the woman carefully as Holmes circled her like a predator studying prey. "Your husband, madam, a botanist, I perceive, recently returned from travels. South America, to be precise." Mrs. Pemberton's eyes widened. "How could you possibly? The faint scent of exotic spices clinging to your shawl, the unusual tan line on your ring finger suggesting a recently removed wedding band of foreign craftsmanship, and the pressed flower in your reticule, unmistakably from the Amazon basin." Holmes's eyes glittered with that familiar intensity. "But pray continue. What makes you believe your husband met with foul play?" The story that emerged painted a picture of increasing impossibility. Professor Edmund Pemberton had been found 3 days prior in his locked study, seated peacefully at his desk, as if he'd simply fallen asleep while examining his plant specimens. No wounds, no signs of struggle, no evidence of poison in his system. "But the room, Mr. Holmes," Mrs. Pemberton whispered. "It smelled like a tropical paradise in the middle of October. And the plants, they were blooming out of season, vibrant and alive in ways that shouldn't be possible in London's autumn chill." Holmes exchanged a glance with Watson. "The study was locked from the inside, you said?" "Yes, but—" She hesitated. "The key was found in my husband's coat pocket in the hallway." "If he'd locked himself in, how did the key end up outside the room?" Within the hour, they stood before the Pemberton townhouse, a stately 3-story building in Bloomsbury. Inspector Bradshaw, a practical man with little patience for botanical mysteries, met them at the door. "Holmes, glad you're here to sort this nonsense. The widow's convinced herself there's murder afoot, but I've examined every inch of that room. Natural death, plain and simple." But as they climbed to the study on the second floor, Holmes noticed things the good inspector had missed. Fresh muddy footprints on the stairs, despite the household staff's meticulous cleaning. The faint scent of Brazilian tobacco mixed with something sweeter, more exotic. And most curious of all, the sound of dripping water coming from somewhere within the walls. The study itself was a marvel of botanical organization. Specimens lined every shelf, their labels written in Edmund's careful script. Charts of South American flora covered the walls. And indeed, the air held that tropical sweetness Mrs. Pemberton had described. Holmes knelt beside the desk where the professor had been found. His magnifying glass revealed tiny particles of unusual soil, earth that seemed too rich, too dark for London gardens. But it was Watson who made the first crucial observation. "Holmes, look at this." Watson held up a railway ticket stub. "Kew Gardens, dated 3 days ago. He was there just before he died." But Holmes had already moved to examine the plants themselves. His fingers traced the edges of leaves that should have been dormant, flowers that bloomed in defiance of the season. And then, near the doorway, something that made him freeze. A single petal. Fresh, vibrant, unmistakably tropical. But here was the impossible part. It belonged to none of the plants in the room. "Mrs. Pemberton," Holmes said quietly, "I'll need to speak with everyone who had access to this house. Your husband's research partner, the greenhouse keeper, anyone who knew his schedule." As if summoned by his words, voices echoed from the hallway. Dr. Marcus Whitfield arrived with ink-stained fingers and the harried look of a man under pressure. Behind him came Timothy Morse, the greenhouse keeper, whose eyes immediately darted toward the conservatory door when he noticed Holmes observing him. "Terrible business," Dr. Whitfield muttered, checking his pocket watch. "Edmund was so close to a breakthrough. Time-sensitive research, you understand. Can't afford delays." But Holmes was studying Timothy Morse, noting how the man's hands trembled slightly when he glanced at certain plants, how his breathing quickened when Holmes mentioned the locked room, and most interesting of all, how his eyes kept returning to that single fallen petal. "Tell me, Mr. Morse," Holmes said casually, "what do you make of the plants blooming so vibrantly despite the season?" The greenhouse keeper's answer would prove more revealing than anyone expected. Timothy Morse shifted uncomfortably under Holmes's steady gaze. "Well, sir, the professor, he had ways of making things grow. Special techniques from his travels, you might say." "Techniques?" Holmes pressed, his voice deceptively casual. "Pray elaborate." But before Morse could respond, a commotion in the hallway announced another arrival. Professor Elena Vasquez swept into the room, her dark eyes immediately cataloging the exotic specimens with the practiced gaze of an expert. Her hands, however, trembled noticeably when she approached certain plants. "Mrs. Pemberton wrote to me about Edmund's passing," she said, her Spanish accent lending weight to her words. "I came as soon as I could. We were colleagues, research partners, you might say." Holmes noted how she avoided naming specific plant species, how her fingers seemed to recognize certain specimens by touch alone. "You knew Professor Pemberton's work intimately, I presume?" "Edmund was passionate about his research," Dr. Whitfield interjected, still consulting his pocket watch with nervous frequency. "Perhaps too passionate. He'd been complaining of headaches lately, dizzy spells. I told him to rest, but he wouldn't listen." Mrs. Pemberton's head snapped up. "Headaches? But he never mentioned—" "Marcus, he told me he felt perfectly fine." The contradiction hung in the air like incense. Holmes filed it away with growing interest. "Mr. Morse, you maintained the greenhouse facilities. Did anyone else have access to the conservatory the night Professor Pemberton died?" "No, sir. Locked it myself at sunset, just as always. No one could have entered." But even as he spoke, Timothy's eyes betrayed him, glancing toward the floor where fresh muddy footprints suggested otherwise. Holmes knelt to examine the prints more closely. The soil was unusual, darker, richer than typical London earth. Under his magnifying glass, he detected traces of organic compounds that shouldn't exist in English gardens. "Fascinating. Dr. Whitfield, you mentioned the professor's recent symptoms. When exactly did these begin?" 2 weeks ago, perhaps 3, right around the time that telegram arrived from Brazil." "Telegram?" Holmes's interest sharpened. Professor Vasquez grew pale. "Edmund received correspondence from our former associates in South America. There were concerns about the specimens he'd brought back." "What sort of concerns?" Watson asked, but Vasquez seemed reluctant to elaborate. Holmes moved to Professor Pemberton's desk, examining the papers scattered across its surface. Laboratory notes detailed recent experiments with South American specimens, but certain pages had been systematically removed. Fresh ink suggested recent alterations to plant care schedules. "Most curious," Holmes murmured, running his finger along the torn edges of missing journal pages. "Someone has been quite selective in their editing." Dr. Whitfield cleared his throat nervously. Edmund was very protective of his research. He may have removed sensitive pages himself. But Holmes had found something more interesting. Hidden beneath a stack of botanical illustrations was a pressed flower bookmark, a delicate specimen marking a page about deadly nightshade variants native to the Amazon basin. The page described alkaloid compounds capable of causing gradual neurological symptoms, headaches, dizziness, eventual respiratory failure. "Tell me, Professor Vasquez," Holmes said suddenly, "what exactly was the nature of your research partnership with the deceased?" Elena Vasquez's composure finally cracked. We studied indigenous plant knowledge, traditional medicines, but some of the specimens," she looked around nervously, "some were obtained without proper permissions. Edmund felt it was justified for the advancement of science, but the native communities, they had different opinions." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Holmes continued his examination, noting how the conservatory's environmental systems had been recently adjusted. Automatic watering mechanisms, ventilation controls, heating elements, all designed to maintain tropical conditions within London's harsh climate. "Mr. Morse," Holmes said quietly, "you understand these systems intimately, do you not? The timing mechanisms, the atmospheric controls?" Timothy's Adam's apple bobbed nervously. "Yes, sir. Have to, don't I? Plants need precise conditions to survive." But Holmes had spotted something that made his blood run cold. Among the environmental control notes, he found a maintenance schedule showing recent adjustments to the nighttime ventilation cycle, changes that would concentrate airborne particles during the exact hours Professor Pemberton worked alone in his study. "Watson," he whispered urgently, "examine these atmospheric readings. Tell me what you see." Watson studied the data, his medical training allowing him to recognize the significance immediately. "Good heavens, Holmes. These alkaloid concentrations, they'd be fatal in an enclosed space." Suddenly, Timothy Morse bolted for the door, but Holmes was ready. "I think not, Mr. Morse. We have much to discuss about your intimate knowledge of botanical toxicology." As Watson restrained the greenhouse keeper, Holmes realized they'd only scratched the surface of this deadly puzzle. The method was becoming clear, but the full scope of the conspiracy would prove far more complex than anyone imagined. Don't go anywhere, because what happens next will shock you. Make sure to hit that like button if you're enjoying this investigation as much as I am. As Timothy Morse struggled in Watson's grip, Holmes held up a hand for patience. "Before we proceed with accusations, Mr. Morse, perhaps you could explain why your boots match the muddy prints leading to the conservatory, prints you claimed were impossible." But before Morse could answer, Dr. Whitfield stepped forward with an expression of genuine confusion. "Mr. Holmes, surely you don't suspect Timothy? I can vouch for his whereabouts the night Edmund died. He was with me at the Royal Society lecture until nearly midnight." Holmes paused, his razor-sharp mind quickly reassessing. "The Royal Society lecture? On what subject?" "Advances in atmospheric chemistry. I presented my research on gas absorption in enclosed environments. Timothy attended as my guest. He has quite a keen interest in the scientific applications of his greenhouse work." Watson released Morse as Holmes processed this new information. The greenhouse keeper rubbed his wrists, his earlier panic replaced by indignation. "That's right, sir. Dr. Whitfield can tell you. I was there taking notes, asking questions. Didn't leave until the good doctor did." Holmes quickly dispatched a street child with instructions to verify this alibi at the Royal Society. Within 20 minutes, the boy returned with confirmation from multiple witnesses. Both men had indeed been present during the estimated time of Edmund Pemberton's death. "Then we have a problem," Holmes murmured, examining his evidence with fresh eyes. "If neither of you is present, how do we explain the muddy footprints, the recent adjustments to the environmental systems, the missing journal pages?" Professor Vasquez had grown increasingly agitated during this exchange. "Mr. Holmes, there's something else you should know. The Brazilian correspondence Edmund received, it wasn't just concerns about permissions. There were threats." She produced a telegram from her reticule, its Portuguese text still clear, despite being 2 weeks old. Holmes's linguistic skills allowed him to decipher the message. "The spirits of the forest demand justice. What was stolen must be returned, or the price will be paid in blood." Melodramatic, Holmes observed, but potentially significant. "Who sent this?" "A representative of the Kayapo people," Vasquez explained. "Edmund's expedition had, appropriated certain sacred plants without tribal consent, plants they believe carry the souls of their ancestors. Mrs. Pemberton gasped. Edmund never told me anything about stolen plants or angry tribes. But Holmes was studying the telegram more carefully. Something about the paper, the ink, the very composition of the message struck him as odd. Professor Vasquez, you read Portuguese fluently, I presume? Of course. I spent 3 years in Brazil with Edmund. Then perhaps you can explain why this telegram contains several grammatical errors no native speaker would make. Why the paper stock matches that used by London telegraph offices rather than Brazilian ones. Vasquez's face drained of color. I don't understand what you're implying. I'm implying, Holmes said coldly, that this telegram was composed right here in London by someone familiar with Portuguese but not fluent in it. Someone who wanted to create the impression of vengeful natives while concealing their own involvement. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Holmes continued his relentless analysis. Furthermore, your reaction to certain plant specimens suggests intimate familiarity with their properties, particularly their toxic potential, and your claim of research partnership with the deceased. Was that relationship perhaps more complex than you've admitted? Professor Vasquez backed toward the door, but Watson was already there. Edmund and we had disagreements about the ethical implications of our work, but I would never what? Holmes pressed. Never expose his theft of indigenous knowledge? Never threaten to destroy his reputation unless he made amends? Never use your expertise in botanical toxicology to exact justice for the communities you claim to protect? But even as Holmes built his case against Vasquez, something nagged at his detective instincts. The evidence was almost too convenient, too neatly packaged, and there was still the matter of that mysterious petal, the one that belonged to no plant in the study. Timothy Morse had been watching this exchange with growing agitation. Finally, he spoke up. Mr. Holmes, sir, there's something else you ought to know. About the conservatory systems. Yes, they're controlled by a master timer in the basement. Anyone who knew the schedule could adjust them remotely. And that telegram Professor Vasquez is holding, I saw her writing something very similar in Portuguese just yesterday in the greenhouse office. Holmes felt the pieces of the puzzle shifting once again. Professor Vasquez might indeed be involved, but the complexity of the environmental manipulation suggested additional expertise, someone with intimate knowledge of both botanical toxicology and mechanical systems. I think, Holmes said slowly, we need to examine this basement control room, and I suspect we'll find that this case involves more than one conspirator. As they descended into the building's mechanical heart, Holmes couldn't shake the feeling that the real mastermind was still hidden in plain sight. The basement of the Pemberton townhouse revealed a mechanical marvel that impressed even Holmes. Brass pipes carried heated air throughout the building, while an intricate system of pulleys and timers controlled water flow to the conservatory above. Timothy Morse moved through this maze of machinery with obvious familiarity, his earlier nervousness replaced by professional pride. Professor Pemberton spared no expense, Morse explained, adjusting a valve with practiced ease. These systems maintain perfect tropical conditions year-round. Temperature, humidity, air circulation, all precisely controlled. Holmes examined the master control panel, noting recent chalk marks indicating timer adjustments. These modifications were made recently? Yes, sir. Just last week, in fact. The professor wanted the nighttime cycle extended to accommodate his evening research sessions. But Professor Vasquez had grown increasingly defensive. Mr. Holmes, your accusations are quite unfair. Yes, I was concerned about Edmund's methods, but that doesn't make me a murderer. Then explain your presence in this house yesterday, Holmes countered, writing what appeared to be Portuguese correspondence in the greenhouse office. I was preparing a letter to Brazilian authorities about Edmund's death. They needed to be informed about the fate of their cultural specimens. Mrs. Pemberton, who had followed them into the basement, suddenly spoke up. Elena, you've been here before? Yesterday? But I thought you only arrived this morning. The Spanish botanist's careful composure finally cracked completely. Charlotte, yes, I arrived yesterday. I couldn't bear to tell you immediately. Edmund and we had been corresponding about returning the specimens to Brazil. He was finally ready to make amends. Holmes studied her carefully. The grief in her voice seemed genuine, but years of detecting deception had taught him to look beyond surface emotions. You say Professor Pemberton was prepared to return the specimens. That would represent a significant financial loss. Money wasn't important to him anymore. Vasquez insisted. He'd been having nightmares about the expedition, about what we'd taken from those communities. Dr. Whitfield, who had remained silent during this exchange, suddenly cleared his throat. Actually, that's not entirely accurate, Elena. Edmund spoke to me just last week about expanding the collection. He'd increased his insurance policy and was planning another expedition to the Amazon. Mrs. Pemberton stared at her husband's research partner. Another expedition? But he promised me he was finished with dangerous travel. Financial pressures, Whitfield explained uncomfortably. The current specimens were worth a fortune to pharmaceutical companies, but Edmund needed funding for advanced laboratory equipment. He saw one final expedition as the solution. Holmes felt the case shifting once again. If Pemberton had been planning expansion rather than repatriation, it cast Vasquez's claims in an entirely different light. Professor Vasquez, were you aware of these expansion plans? Edmund wouldn't have. He promised the tribal elders. Her voice trailed off as the implications became clear. But Timothy Morse had been growing increasingly agitated as they discussed the collection's value. All these grand plans and promises, he muttered, but who does the real work? Who keeps the plants alive day after day while everyone else takes credit? Holmes turned his full attention to the greenhouse keeper. You feel underappreciated in your work, Mr. Morse? 20 years I've served this family. Started as a garden boy, learned everything about exotic plants, about keeping them alive in this miserable climate. And what recognition do I get? What share of the profits when pharmaceutical companies come calling? The bitterness in Morse's voice was unmistakable. Holmes began to see a different pattern emerging, not revenge for indigenous communities, not ethical concerns about stolen specimens, but simple human resentment born of years of thankless labor. Tell me, Mr. Morse, Holmes said quietly, about your background. Where did you learn your expertise with South American flora? Morse's hands clenched at his sides. My grandmother was from Brazil, indigenous Kayapo. She taught me about plants before she died, their powers, their spirits, their dangers. Professor Vasquez gasped. You're Kayapo? But why didn't you say anything when Edmund and I returned from the expedition? Because I learned long ago that my heritage means nothing to people like you, Morse replied bitterly. You go to Brazil, steal our knowledge, profit from our wisdom, and call it scientific discovery. While I, a descendant of the very people you've robbed, remain invisible in your precious greenhouse. Holmes felt the final pieces clicking into place. The intimate knowledge of botanical toxicology, the access to environmental controls, the personal motivation rooted in cultural theft and personal humiliation. But there was still the matter of timing. How had Morse managed the murder while maintaining his alibi at the Royal Society? Mr. Morse, Holmes said slowly, I believe it's time you showed us exactly how those automated systems can be programmed for delayed activation. The greenhouse keeper's face went pale as he realized his fatal error. As Timothy Morse led them through the intricate timing mechanisms, Holmes noticed something that made his detective instincts sharpen. The man moved with the confidence of someone intimately familiar with every component, but there was something more, a proprietary pride that suggested deeper involvement than mere maintenance. These systems, Morse explained, his voice taking on a technical precision, can be programmed days in advance. Temperature changes, humidity adjustments, even the release of vaporized plant extracts for pest control. All automated, all timed to the minute. Holmes examined the control dials more closely. And these recent adjustments? You made them at Professor Pemberton's request? Morse hesitated, and in that pause, Holmes heard the sound of footsteps upstairs. Mrs. Pemberton had returned to the main floor, but the footsteps were too heavy, too purposeful to be hers. Watson moved toward the basement stairs, his hand instinctively reaching for his service revolver. Holmes, we may have visitors. The sound of voices drifted down. Authoritative, official. Holmes recognized Inspector Bradshaw's gruff tones, but there were others with him. Through the basement windows, Holmes could see additional police vehicles arriving on the street. It seems, Holmes murmured, that word of our investigation has reached official ears. Professor Vasquez grew agitated. Mr. Holmes, there's something else you must know. Edmund's collection. It's not just botanically valuable. Some of those specimens were obtained from sites the Brazilian government now considers sacred archaeological locations. Archaeological? Dr. Whitfield looked genuinely surprised. Edmund never mentioned anything about archaeological significance, because he was planning to sell them before anyone realized their true cultural importance. Vasquez revealed. Plants that grow only in specific ceremonial grounds, specimens that are literally irreplaceable. The British Museum has been pressuring him for access, but he was stalling while he negotiated with private collectors. The footsteps above grew more numerous, and Holmes could hear Mrs. Pemberton's voice raised in distress. Timothy Morse had grown increasingly pale as the conversation continued. "Mr. Morse," Holmes said softly, "your grandmother, when did she pass away?" 3 years ago, Morse replied, his voice barely above a whisper, just after Professor Pemberton's expedition returned. She was the last keeper of certain plant knowledge in our family line." Holmes felt the emotional weight behind the greenhouse keeper's words. "And she saw the specimens Professor Pemberton brought back?" Morse nodded, tears forming in his eyes. "She recognized plants from our ancestral grounds, sacred specimens that were never meant to leave the forest. She died knowing her people's wisdom had been stolen and would be sold to the highest bidder." The complexity of the case was expanding beyond simple murder into questions of cultural theft, international law, and familial honor. But Holmes also sensed they were running out of time as the police presence upstairs grew more insistent. Dr. Whitfield checked his pocket watch again, his nervousness increasing. "I really must insist we conclude this investigation. I have urgent business matters to attend to." "What sort of business matters?" Holmes inquired. "The pharmaceutical representatives are arriving this afternoon to examine the collection. If Edmund's death is ruled suspicious, they'll withdraw their offers. Hundreds of thousands of pounds are at stake." Professor Vasquez stared at Whitfield in horror. "You're proceeding with the sale even after Edmund's death, even knowing the specimens were stolen from sacred sites?" "Business is business," Whitfield replied coldly. "Edmund signed the contracts. His widow inherits the obligations as well as the assets." But Holmes had been studying Timothy Morse throughout this exchange, and he noticed something crucial. When Whitfield mentioned the pharmaceutical contracts, Morse's expression hadn't shown surprise. It had shown satisfaction, as if a long-planned element was finally falling into place. "Mr. Morse," Holmes said quietly, "you knew about these contracts all along, didn't you?" The greenhouse keeper straightened, and suddenly his demeanor changed completely. Gone was the nervous, subservient employee. In his place stood a man with years of suppressed intelligence and carefully planned revenge. "I knew everything, Mr. Holmes. Every business meeting, every negotiation, every plan to profit from my people's stolen knowledge. You see, when you're invisible to people like Professor Pemberton, you hear things, you learn things, you plan things." The sound of heavy boots on the basement stairs interrupted his confession. Inspector Bradshaw appeared, flanked by 2 constables. "Holmes, there's been a development. We've received word that someone's been threatening to destroy the entire botanical collection unless certain demands are met. Anonymous letters delivered to the British Museum and the Royal Society." Holmes looked at Timothy Morse, who was smiling for the first time since they'd met him. "I believe," Holmes said slowly, "we're about to discover that this case involves considerably more than murder." Inspector Bradshaw held up a collection of letters, each written in the same careful script. "These arrived this morning at various institutions around London, all threatening to destroy Professor Pemberton's botanical collection unless it's returned to its rightful guardians within 5 days. Holmes examined the correspondence, noting the precise handwriting, the quality of the paper, the careful attention to detail. The same hand that altered Professor Pemberton's research schedules, I suspect. Timothy Morse no longer attempted to hide his involvement. "My grandmother spent her final months teaching me to write properly. She said if I was going to live in the white man's world, I needed to speak their language better than they did." Professor Vasquez moved closer to Morse, her earlier fear replaced by something resembling admiration. "You've been planning this for 3 years, since your grandmother died?" "Every day since her funeral," Morse confirmed, "learning every detail of the collection's value, understanding every business relationship, every legal obligation. I knew that simply stealing the plants wouldn't be enough. They had to be returned properly with acknowledgement of the theft." Mrs. Pemberton, who had followed the police downstairs, stared at her former employee in shock. "Timothy, if you wanted the plants returned, why didn't you simply ask? After Edmund's death, I would have considered." "Would you?" Morse challenged. "Would you have given up hundreds of thousands of pounds to honor the rights of people you've never met? People your husband dismissed as ignorant natives?" The moral complexity of the situation was becoming clear to everyone present. Dr. Whitfield, however, remained focused on practical matters. Inspector, surely we can resolve this dispute without destroying valuable scientific specimens. Perhaps some form of compensation to the relevant parties. Compensation? Morse's voice rose with decades of suppressed fury. You want to pay money for what was never yours to take? These aren't commodities to be bought and sold. They're living connections to my ancestors' spirits. Holmes studied the emotional dynamics playing out before him. Mr. Morse, your passion for justice is admirable, but murder is never the answer to cultural theft. Murder? Morse looked genuinely confused. Mr. Holmes, I've made no confession to murder. I've admitted to planning the return of stolen cultural artifacts, yes. But killing Professor Pemberton, that was never part of my plan. The declaration stopped everyone short. Holmes felt his carefully constructed theory wavering. Then how do you explain your intimate knowledge of the environmental systems? The timing mechanisms that could have delivered a fatal dose of botanical toxins? Morse smiled grimly. Because that's exactly how I plan to destroy the collection if my demands weren't met. I know how to concentrate alkaloid compounds in enclosed spaces. It's the same principle I was going to use to kill the plants, not Professor Pemberton. Watson, who had been listening intently, spoke up. But the method that killed Pemberton, it's identical to what you just described. Similar, yes, but I never activated it. My plan was to wait until after the pharmaceutical inspection, then destroy everything if the plants weren't returned voluntarily. Professor Vasquez had grown very quiet during this exchange. Holmes noticed her examining her hands, which were trembling more violently than before. Professor Vasquez, you've been unusually silent. Any thoughts on Mr. Morse's claims? I think there's something I need to confess, she said quietly. About my real relationship with Edmund and why I came to London. Mrs. Pemberton looked stricken. Elena, what are you saying? Charlotte, your husband and I, our partnership in Brazil was more than professional. We were lovers. But when we returned to London, he chose his reputation and his marriage over any future with me. The admission hit Mrs. Pemberton like a physical blow. She stumbled against Watson, who steadied her gently. Elena, how could you? You were my friend. I was consumed by jealousy and rage, Vasquez continued. When Edmund told me about the pharmaceutical contracts, about his plans to profit from our expedition while discarding me entirely, I wanted revenge. Holmes felt the pieces rearranging themselves once again. Revenge in the form of exposing his theft of indigenous knowledge. At first, yes, I thought public humiliation would be enough. But when Timothy approached me about returning the plants to Brazil, she looked at Morse with something approaching gratitude. I realized there was a chance for real justice, not just personal satisfaction. Inspector Bradshaw was growing impatient with the moral complexities. All very interesting, but we still have a dead man and no clear confession. Holmes, can you sort this out definitively? Holmes looked around the basement at the assembled suspects, each with motive, each with knowledge, each capable of the crime. But there was something about the physical evidence that still nagged at him. I think, he said slowly, we need to return to the scene of the crime, because I suspect the real killer has been hiding in plain sight all along. As they climbed back toward the study, Holmes's mind raced through the accumulating evidence. 3 individuals with means, motive, and opportunity. Multiple systems capable of delivering the fatal toxins. And still, that mysterious petal that belonged to no plant in the room. But as they reached the ground floor, Mrs. Hudson appeared with alarming news. Mr. Holmes, there's been an attempt on Mrs. Pemberton's life, just 20 minutes ago while you were all downstairs. The group rushed to the parlor where they found signs of recent disturbance. An overturned chair, scattered papers, and the distinct smell of gas in the air. The gaslight fixture, Holmes observed, examining the ornate brass fitting. Someone attempted to create an accidental gas leak, but see here. He produced his magnifying glass. Traces of those same unusual alkaloid compounds we found in the study. Inspector Bradshaw frowned. A gas leak that wasn't actually gas? Precisely. Someone used the existing fixture to introduce botanical toxins into the air supply. Had Mrs. Pemberton remained in this room much longer? Holmes let the implications hang unspoken. Dr. Whitfield checked his pocket watch nervously. This is getting entirely out of hand. Perhaps we should postpone the pharmaceutical inspection until these matters are resolved. Absolutely not. The voice came from the hallway as a new figure entered. A stern-faced man in expensive clothing carrying a leather briefcase. I am Mr. Blackwood from Harrington Pharmaceuticals. We have traveled considerable distance for this appointment, and our offer expires at midnight. Holmes studied the newcomer with interest. Rather aggressive business practices, Mr. Blackwood. Most companies would postpone negotiations following a suspicious death. Business is business, Mr. Holmes. Dead men don't renegotiate contracts. The callousness of the statement sent a chill through the room. But Holmes had noticed something else. Blackwood's shoes bore traces of the same unusual soil they'd found throughout the house. Timothy Morse had been watching Blackwood with undisguised hatred. You're the one buying stolen sacred plants to turn into medicines for profit. You know exactly what Edmund Pemberton stole from my people. I know that certain botanical specimens have valuable pharmaceutical applications. Blackwood replied coldly. Their geographic origins and cultural significance are irrelevant to their scientific utility. Professor Vasquez stepped forward angrily. Irrelevant? These plants represent thousands of years of indigenous knowledge. Knowledge that was stolen without consent or compensation. Knowledge that will be used to heal diseases and save lives, Blackwood countered. Surely that justifies any minor cultural concerns. Holmes watched this exchange with growing interest. The pharmaceutical representative seemed remarkably well informed about the specific specimens and their properties. More informed, perhaps, than a simple businessman should be. Mr. Blackwood, Holmes inquired casually, you seem quite knowledgeable about botanical toxicology. Professional training, perhaps? I have extensive experience with plant-based pharmaceuticals. But Holmes had noticed how Blackwood's eyes kept returning to certain specimens in the study, and how his breathing changed when he approached particular plants. The man wasn't just knowledgeable, he was personally familiar with these exact specimens. Watson had been examining the attempted gas leak more closely. Holmes, the timing mechanism here is identical to the one in the basement, but this was activated remotely after we'd all gone downstairs. Which means, Holmes concluded, our killer is either still in the house or has developed some form of remote activation system. Timothy Morse suddenly grew very still. Mr. Holmes, there's something about those environmental systems I haven't told you. They're not just controlled from the basement. Professor Pemberton installed remote controls in several locations throughout the house. Remote controls? Pneumatic signals transmitted through the existing pipe system. The conservatory, the study, even the parlor, all connected to the master controls. Holmes felt the final pieces clicking into place. And who, besides yourself and Professor Pemberton, would know about these remote control systems? Anyone who had spent considerable time studying the house's mechanical systems, Morse replied. Anyone who had been here frequently enough to understand the layout, the timing, the capabilities. All eyes turned to Dr. Whitfield, who had grown notably pale. But Holmes was looking at Mr. Blackwood, whose expensive shoes and intimate knowledge of the specimens suggested multiple previous visits to this house. I think, Holmes announced, it's time we examined these remote control systems more closely, and I suspect we'll find that our killer has been manipulating this entire investigation from the beginning. As if summoned by his words, a mechanical clicking sound echoed through the house's pipe system. Holmes realized with growing alarm that another time toxin release had just been activated. Everyone out, he shouted. The killer isn't finished with us yet. The evacuation to the street revealed the true scope of the killer's preparation. Holmes counted the timing. Whoever had activated the latest toxin release had done so with intimate knowledge of their investigation schedule, suggesting they had been monitoring the group's movements throughout the day. As they waited for the house to air clear, Holmes noticed Mr. Blackwood consulting not a pocket watch, but a small notebook filled with times and mechanical specifications. Fascinating reading, Mr. Blackwood. The pharmaceutical representative snapped the notebook closed. Simply business schedules, Mr. Holmes. Nothing that concerns this investigation. But Holmes had glimpsed enough of the contents to recognize technical diagrams of the house's environmental systems, detailed enough to suggest multiple visits and careful study. Tell me, when did you first visit this house? Before or after Professor Pemberton's death? That is to say, Blackwood's composure was cracking. I had several preliminary meetings with the professor to assess the collection's commercial value. Mrs. Pemberton looked shocked. Edmund never mentioned any pharmaceutical representatives visiting the house. Dr. Whitfield cleared his throat uncomfortably. Actually, Charlotte, Edmund was quite secretive about his business negotiations. He met with several potential buyers privately, often when you were visiting your sister. Timothy Morse had been listening to this exchange with growing understanding. That's why you knew about the environmental systems. he said to Blackwood. You've been here multiple times, studying everything, planning everything. But Holmes was connecting larger patterns. Mr. Blackwood, your company, but Holmes was connecting larger patterns. Mr. Blackwood, your company, Harrington Pharmaceuticals, has been accused of biopiracy in South America before, has it not? Taking traditional medicines and patenting them without acknowledging indigenous origins. Blackwood's face flushed with anger. Those are baseless accusations from primitive societies that don't understand intellectual property law. Primitive societies? Timothy Morse's voice was deadly quiet. Like my grandmother's people. Who developed the medicinal knowledge you're stealing? Professor Vasquez suddenly understood. Edmund wasn't just selling to you. He was providing you with the traditional preparation methods, the ancestral knowledge needed to synthesize the compounds properly. Knowledge that was freely given during our expedition, Blackwood said defensively. We compensated local guides appropriately. You gave them trinkets and alcohol in exchange for sacred medical wisdom, Morse exploded. Wisdom my grandmother spent 70 years learning, that you plan to patent and sell back to the world. Holmes held up a hand for silence. The financial records I examined earlier showed payments from Harrington Pharmaceuticals dating back 6 months. Mr. Blackwood, you weren't just buying specimens. You were funding Professor Pemberton's entire operation from the beginning. Mrs. Pemberton stared at her husband's business partner. Marcus, you knew about this? About Edmund taking money from pharmaceutical companies? Dr. Whitfield nodded reluctantly. The research was expensive, Charlotte. We needed funding for equipment, for travel, for laboratory analysis. Harrington offered generous terms that included exclusive rights to all synthesis methods. Holmes added, studying Blackwood's increasingly desperate expression. But there was a problem, wasn't there? Professor Pemberton was having second thoughts about the ethics of your arrangement. Blackwood's composure finally shattered completely. Edmund was going to break our contract. 3 years of investment, hundreds of thousands in development costs, and he suddenly developed a conscience. He threatened to return everything to Brazil and expose our entire operation. The confession hung in the air like incense. Holmes pressed his advantage. So you decided to eliminate the problem before he could cost your company millions in lost profits. It was supposed to look natural, Blackwood protested. A researcher who spent too much time around dangerous plants, who accidentally exposed himself to toxic compounds. No one would have questioned it. Timothy Morse stepped forward, his fists clenched. You murdered a man to steal my people's medicine, then planned to profit from his death. But Holmes noticed something that made him pause. Professor Vasquez had grown very still during Blackwood's confession, and her expression suggested she knew more than she'd revealed. Professor Vasquez, Holmes said quietly, you arrived in London yesterday, not this morning. You came because you knew something was going to happen to Edmund, didn't you? Elena Vasquez's shoulders sagged in defeat. Edmund contacted me 2 weeks ago. He said Blackwood was pressuring him to provide synthesis methods for sacred plants, compounds that should never be mass-produced. He was frightened, Mr. Holmes. He knew too much about Harrington's illegal operations in South America. So you came to help him? I came to convince him to go public with everything he knew, to expose Harrington's biopiracy before they could expand their operations. Holmes felt the final pieces falling into place. But you arrived too late. Blackwood had already set his plan in motion. Inspector Bradshaw stepped forward to arrest Blackwood, but the pharmaceutical representative made one last desperate move. You have no proof. It's all speculation and hearsay. Holmes smiled grimly. Actually, Mr. Blackwood, we have something much better than speculation. We have your notebook with detailed diagrams of the environmental systems. We have soil samples from your shoes matching the compounds found at the crime scene. And most importantly, he produced the mysterious petal from his coat pocket. We have this. Holmes held the vibrant petal up to the afternoon light streaming through the windows. This single specimen has been the key to everything. A flower that belongs to none of the plants in Professor Pemberton's study, yet somehow appeared at the scene of his death. Mr. Blackwood stared at the petal with obvious recognition and growing fear. That could have come from anywhere. Could it? Holmes moved to the conservatory, the group following close behind. This petal belongs to a very specific variety of Amazon lily, Nymphaea amazonum, notable for its deep purple coloration and distinctive fragrance. Professor Vasquez, you're familiar with this species? Elena nodded slowly. It's extremely rare, found only in certain ceremonial pools. The indigenous people consider it sacred. They believe it carries the spirits of their ancestors. Timothy Morse's eyes widened with recognition. My grandmother told me about those flowers. She said they only bloom when an injustice demands to be avenged. Poetic, Holmes observed, but not particularly scientific. However, this particular specimen has a more mundane explanation. He turned to face Blackwood directly. You see, this flower doesn't grow naturally in London's climate. It requires very specific conditions that can only be maintained in a specialized laboratory environment. Blackwood's face had gone ashen. I don't know what you're implying. I'm implying that you've been cultivating these specimens in Harrington Pharmaceuticals' research facility, not for their spiritual significance, but because they produce compounds essential to your synthesis process, compounds you couldn't replicate without access to living plants. Doctor, Whitfield looked confused. But how would such a petal end up in Edmund's study? Holmes smiled grimly. Because Mr. Blackwood brought it with him during one of his business meetings. A small piece of evidence that he failed to notice had fallen from his briefcase, evidence that places him at the scene with materials that could only have come from his laboratory. Inspector Bradshaw examined the petal more closely. Holmes, are you certain this couldn't have come from the professor's own collection? Absolutely certain. Professor Pemberton's specimens were preserved in alcohol and pressed between glass plates for study. This petal is fresh, recently cut from a living plant, and Professor Vasquez can confirm that Nymphea amazonum wasn't among the species they brought back from Brazil. Vasquez nodded emphatically. Edmund specifically avoided taking ceremonial plants. He knew they were too sacred to the indigenous communities. But Holmes had been studying Blackwood's reactions throughout this explanation, and he noticed something crucial. The man wasn't just frightened. He was angry, with the specific fury of someone whose carefully laid plans had been undone by a trivial oversight. Mr. Blackwood, Holmes continued, you made several critical errors in your execution of this crime. First, you underestimated Professor Pemberton's growing conscience. Second, you failed to account for Mr. Morse's intimate knowledge of the environmental systems. And third, he held up the petal again. You brought evidence from your own laboratory to the crime scene. Blackwood's composure finally cracked completely. You think you're so clever, Holmes? But you have no idea how far this goes. Harrington Pharmaceuticals has operations in 12 countries, contracts with governments, military applications for these compounds. The admission sent a chill through the group. Mrs. Pemberton stared at the man who had murdered her husband. Military applications? Edmund was developing medicine, not weapons. Medicine, weapons. The distinction is merely a matter of dosage. Blackwood sneered. The same alkaloids that can treat neurological disorders can also incapacitate enemy soldiers. Your husband was sitting on a gold mine of chemical warfare applications. Timothy Morse stepped forward, his face twisted with rage. You murdered him for chemical weapons? You turned my people's healing knowledge into tools of war? But Holmes noticed that Professor Vasquez had grown extremely agitated during Blackwood's confession. Her hands were shaking, and she kept glancing toward the conservatory's exit as if calculating escape routes. Professor Vasquez, Holmes said quietly, there's something else you haven't told us, isn't there? About Edmund's research, about what he discovered in those final weeks. Elena's voice was barely a whisper. Edmund found something in the ceremonial plants. Something that could neutralize the military applications Blackwood wanted. A natural antidote that would make the weapons useless. And that's why Blackwood had to kill him immediately, Holmes concluded. Not just to prevent him from breaking the contract, but to stop him from developing compounds that would undermine Harrington's entire military research program. Blackwood lunged toward the conservatory door, but Watson was ready. As the two men struggled, Holmes heard the distinctive sound of mechanical timers activating throughout the house. He's triggered the entire system, Timothy shouted. The whole house is about to be flooded with toxic compounds. Holmes realized they had walked directly into Blackwood's final trap. The mechanical clicking sounds grew more insistent as automated systems throughout the house began their deadly sequence. Holmes quickly assessed their options. The front door was too far, the windows were sealed for winter, and the basement exit would take them directly through the most concentrated toxin zones. The conservatory, Timothy Morse shouted over the growing mechanical noise. There's a roof access through the glass panels. It's the only way out. But as they rushed toward the conservatory, Mr. Blackwood broke free from Watson's grip and positioned himself between the group and their escape route. In his hand was a small brass device. the master control for the entire environmental system. You want to see how this ends? Blackwood snarled, his businessman's facade completely abandoned. I'll show you exactly what happens to people who interfere with Harrington Pharmaceuticals. He twisted a dial on the device, and immediately the air began to fill with a sweet, cloying scent, the same tropical fragrance that had surrounded Professor Pemberton's death. Holmes felt his detective mind racing even as his lungs began to burn. Watson, the glass ceiling. Can you reach the emergency release? Watson was already moving, using his military training to assess the conservatory's structure. There's a manual override near the central support beam, but someone needs to hold Blackwood back. Timothy Morse stepped forward without hesitation. This ends now, he said, his voice carrying the weight of generations of injustice. You've stolen enough from my people. The two men grappled for control of the device while Holmes quickly calculated the timing. The alkaloid concentration was increasing rapidly, but they had perhaps 3 minutes before it reached lethal levels. Professor Vasquez had collapsed against a plant table, the toxic air affecting her more severely than the others. Elena, Mrs. Pemberton rushed to support her, but Holmes noticed something odd about Vasquez's reaction. It was too specific, too targeted, as if she recognized exactly which compounds were being released. Professor Vasquez, Holmes called out urgently, you know these specific alkaloids, don't you? From your time in Brazil? Even struggling for breath, Elena managed to nod. Ceremonial compounds used for vision quests, but this concentration will cause permanent damage. Holmes understood immediately. You know the antidote, the compound Edmund discovered that could neutralize these effects. Vasquez pointed weakly toward a specific plant near the conservatory's eastern wall. Purple, stem, grind the roots, with water. But Blackwood had heard the exchange. With a burst of desperate strength, he broke free from Timothy's grip and smashed the brass control device against the stone floor. If I can't have the profits, no one gets the antidote. The destruction of the control mechanism sent the entire system into overdrive. Toxic vapors began pouring from every vent, every pipe, every carefully engineered opening in the house's environmental system. Watson had reached the glass ceiling's manual release, but the mechanism was corroded from years of London's industrial atmosphere. Holmes, I need something to break the seal. Inspector Bradshaw, despite the thickening air, managed to draw his service revolver. Stand clear! The gunshot shattered the silence and the glass simultaneously. Cool October air rushed in, diluting the toxic concentration. But Holmes knew they needed more than fresh air to save everyone. Timothy Morse had reached the plant Vasquez indicated, his indigenous heritage giving him instinctive knowledge of how to prepare traditional remedies. His hands worked quickly, grinding roots with water from the automated watering system. Drink this, he commanded, passing the mixture first to Professor Vasquez, then to Mrs. Pemberton, who had been closest to the toxic vents. But Holmes noticed that Blackwood was exhibiting symptoms far more severe than anyone else, symptoms that suggested he had been exposed to these specific compounds before. Mr. Blackwood, how long have you been experimenting with these alkaloids on yourself? The pharmaceutical representative was now on his knees, his breathing labored, his eyes showing the telltale signs of neurological damage. Company, policy, he gasped. All researchers must test. Personal tolerance. The admission revealed the true scope of Harrington Pharmaceuticals' unethical practices. They had been using their own employees as test subjects for compounds stolen from indigenous communities. As the fresh air continued to clear the conservatory, Holmes helped Watson lower emergency rope through the broken ceiling. One by one, they evacuated the house, with Timothy Morse carrying the makeshift antidote and ensuring everyone received treatment. But as they reached the safety of the street, Holmes realized their ordeal was far from over. Approaching sirens suggested that word of the incident had reached official channels, and the implications of Blackwood's confessions about military applications meant this case would soon involve authorities far beyond Scotland Yard. Inspector Bradshaw, Holmes said urgently, we need to secure all evidence immediately. This case has international ramifications that go far beyond simple murder. As government carriages began arriving alongside the police vehicles, Holmes knew they were about to discover just how deep the conspiracy truly went. The arrival of government officials transformed the quiet Bloomsbury Street into a scene of controlled chaos. Men in dark suits emerged from unmarked carriages, their authoritative bearing and immediate assumption of command marking them as representatives of Her Majesty's intelligence services. The lead official, a stern-faced man who introduced himself only as Mr. Sterling, approached Holmes with obvious recognition. "Mr. Holmes, I understand you've uncovered some sensitive information regarding Harrington Pharmaceuticals' operations." Holmes studied Sterling carefully, noting the man's expensive clothing, his military bearing, and most tellingly, the way he avoided looking directly at the still struggling Mr. Blackwood. "Sensitive information? I've uncovered evidence of murder, biopiracy, and the development of chemical weapons using stolen indigenous knowledge. All matters of national security," Sterling replied smoothly, "which must be handled through appropriate channels." But Timothy Morse had been listening to this exchange with growing alarm. "Appropriate channels? You mean covering up another theft from indigenous peoples?" Sterling's expression hardened. "Mr. Morse, I suggest you limit your comments to matters directly related to Professor Pemberton's death." Holmes felt the case shifting into dangerous territory. Government involvement suggested that Harrington Pharmaceuticals' operations had official sanction, or at least official tolerance. "Mr. Sterling, are you here to investigate the crime or to suppress evidence of it?" Before Sterling could respond, Professor Vasquez stepped forward, still weak from her exposure to the toxins but determined to speak. "Mr. Holmes, there's something else you need to know. Edmund discovered that Harrington wasn't just developing weapons. They were planning to test them on indigenous communities in South America." The accusation sent a shock through the assembled officials. Mrs. Pemberton stared at the government representatives in horror. "You knew about this? About companies using native peoples as test subjects?" Sterling's composure cracked slightly. "Mrs. Pemberton, you're understandably distraught, but these are complex geopolitical matters that require careful handling." "Complex?" Timothy Morse's voice carried decades of suppressed rage. "It's quite simple, actually. White men steal knowledge from brown people, use it to develop weapons, then test those weapons on the same brown people they stole from." Dr. Whitfield, who had been unusually quiet during the evacuation, suddenly spoke up. "Mr. Sterling, I have documentation of all Harrington's research protocols, including their testing proposals. Edmund made copies of everything before he died." Holmes noticed how quickly Sterling's attention shifted to Whitfield. "Documentation? Where is this documentation currently located?" "Safe," Whitfield replied carefully. "In a location known only to myself and one other party." But Holmes had been studying the interactions between all parties, and something about the timing bothered him. Sterling had arrived remarkably quickly for a government official responding to a local incident, almost as if he had been monitoring the situation already. "Mr. Sterling," Holmes said quietly, "you knew about Professor Pemberton's death before we discovered the murder method, didn't you?" Sterling's silence was answer enough. Holmes continued, "Harrington Pharmaceuticals has been operating under government contract. The military applications weren't an accidental discovery. They were the intended purpose from the beginning." Mrs. Pemberton looked stricken. "Edmund was working for the military? But he told me he was developing medicines to help people." "He was," Professor Vasquez assured her. "Edmund didn't know about the military applications until recently. When he found out, he tried to back out of the contracts. Which is why Blackwood killed him," Holmes concluded. "Not just to protect commercial interests, but to prevent him from exposing a government-sanctioned program of biopiracy and weapons development." Inspector Bradshaw, who had been listening to these revelations with growing discomfort, finally spoke up. "Mr. Sterling, if what Holmes says is true, we're looking at crimes against international law, not just domestic murder." Sterling's mask of official politeness finally dropped completely. "Inspector, I strongly advise you to limit your investigation to the immediate circumstances of Professor Pemberton's death. Broader implications are not within your jurisdiction." But Holmes had noticed something that changed everything. Among the government officials, one man stood apart, not because of his authority, but because of his obvious discomfort with the proceedings. When their eyes met, Holmes saw something unexpected: moral conflict. The man stepped forward hesitantly. "Mr. Sterling, perhaps it's time to consider that this operation has exceeded acceptable parameters." Sterling's face went white. "Agent Morrison, you're out of line." "Am I?" Morrison replied. "Because it seems to me that murder to cover up illegal human experimentation might constitute a breach of acceptable parameters." Holmes realized they had reached the crucial moment. Government agencies were fracturing along moral lines, with some officials horrified by what they had discovered about their own operations. As fog began to roll in with the evening darkness, Holmes knew the next few minutes would determine whether justice would prevail or disappear into the labyrinth of official secrecy. The real climax was about to begin. The fog rolling in from the Thames created an atmosphere of surreal tension as the various factions faced each other in the gaslit street. Holmes realized that the traditional methods of criminal justice were insufficient for a case involving government conspiracy and international law. Agent Morrison's defection from official loyalty had created a crack in Sterling's authority, and Holmes pressed his advantage immediately. "Agent Morrison, I suspect you have access to files that would clarify the full scope of Harrington's operations." Morrison nodded grimly. "Files that show systematic theft of indigenous knowledge across 4 continents, illegal human testing, and weapons development in direct violation of international treaties." Mr. Blackwood, still struggling with the effects of toxic exposure, made one last desperate attempt to salvage his position. "You have no idea what you're interfering with. The compounds we've developed could revolutionize warfare, could give Britain decisive advantages in colonial conflicts." Timothy Morse stepped forward, his indigenous heritage lending weight to his words. "Colonial conflicts? You mean using our own medicine to kill us more efficiently?" But Holmes had been studying the physical evidence throughout these confrontations, and he noticed something crucial. The brass control device Blackwood had destroyed. It wasn't unique to Professor Pemberton's house. Similar devices would exist wherever Harrington had installed their environmental testing systems. "Mr. Sterling," Holmes said quietly, "how many other locations has Harrington equipped with similar environmental control systems? How many other researchers have access to remote-controlled toxin delivery mechanisms?" Sterling's silence confirmed Holmes's suspicions. The murder method used on Professor Pemberton wasn't a one-time innovation. It was part of a systematic capability to eliminate threats to the operation. Professor Vasquez, despite her weakness, managed to speak with growing clarity. Edmund wasn't the first researcher to develop a conscience about the program. There were others, colleagues who disappeared or died in accidents when they tried to expose the truth. Mrs. Pemberton stared at the government officials in horror. "How many people have you killed to protect this secret?" Agent Morrison answered before Sterling could stop him. 7 researchers across 3 countries in the past 2 years, all ruled accidental or natural deaths. All killed using methods derived from their own research. The confession hung in the fog like a death sentence. Holmes realized they were dealing with a systematic program of assassination designed to protect what amounted to state-sponsored biopiracy. But Holmes had been formulating a plan throughout the evening's revelations. "Inspector Bradshaw, I believe we have sufficient evidence to arrest Mr. Blackwood for the murder of Professor Pemberton. The broader conspiracy will require international cooperation, but the immediate crime falls within your jurisdiction." Sterling stepped forward threateningly. "Mr. Holmes, I strongly advise against pursuing this matter further. There are national security implications that supersede local criminal proceedings." "National security?" Timothy Morse's voice carried the authority of ancestral wisdom. "Or national shame? Because what you're describing isn't security. It's institutionalized theft and murder." Holmes noticed that the fog was thickening, creating a natural screen that might provide tactical advantages. "Dr. Whitfield, those documents you mentioned, where exactly are they located?" Whitfield looked around nervously, clearly torn between self-preservation and justice. "There's a safety deposit box at Barclays Bank. The key is hidden in my laboratory at the Royal Society." Sterling made a subtle gesture, and several of his men began moving to surround Whitfield. But Holmes had anticipated this development. "Watson," he called out, and his friend immediately understood. Using the fog as cover, Watson created a diversion that allowed Whitfield to disappear into the maze of London's evening streets. In the confusion that followed, Timothy Morse made his own crucial decision. "Professor Vasquez, you still have contacts in Brazil who could testify about Harrington's operations?" Elena nodded weakly. "Telegraph contacts in Rio de Janeiro, indigenous rights advocates who've been documenting biopiracy for years. Then we make this international," Morse declared. "We expose everything to journalists, to foreign governments, to anyone who will listen." But Sterling had been listening to this planning with growing desperation. "You have no idea what you're unleashing. This program protects British interests around the world." Holmes faced Sterling directly. his voice carrying the moral authority that had made him legendary. British interests, or the interests of men who profit from theft and murder? Because I see no honor in stealing medicine from indigenous healers to create weapons of war. As police whistles began echoing through the fog, Holmes realized that the climax of this case would be determined not by clever deduction, but by the courage of ordinary people to choose justice over expediency. The real battle for the soul of the investigation was about to begin. Comment below what you think happens next. And make sure you're subscribed, because the conclusion to this incredible case will leave you speechless. The police whistles in the fog announced the arrival of reinforcements that would tip the balance decisively. Inspector Bradshaw had managed to send word to Scotland Yard, and now constables were converging from multiple directions, their lanterns creating ghostly pools of light in the thickening mist. But Holmes knew that the true resolution would require more than arrests and official proceedings. The case had exposed a network of corruption that extended far beyond one pharmaceutical company and into the highest levels of government. Agent Morrison, having committed himself to the path of conscience, pulled out a thick folder from his coat. "Mr. Holmes, these are copies of every file related to Operation Botanica, Harrington's code name for their biopiracy program. Names, dates, locations, victims, everything." Sterling made one last desperate attempt to maintain control. "Morrison, that's classified material. You're committing treason." "No," Morrison replied quietly. "I'm preventing it. Because using stolen indigenous knowledge to develop weapons for use against those same indigenous peoples, that's the real treason against human decency." Holmes examined the documents quickly, his detective mind cataloging the scope of the conspiracy. 7 murdered researchers, 23 indigenous communities exploited, 4 governments complicit in the cover-up. The pattern was clear and damning. Mrs. Pemberton approached the still struggling Mr. Blackwood, her grief transformed into something harder and more determined. "You killed my husband because he developed a conscience, because he realized that healing knowledge shouldn't be turned into instruments of death." Blackwood's response was barely coherent through his toxin-induced symptoms, but his words carried the ugly truth. Profit over principles, always. Company policy. Timothy Morse knelt beside Blackwood, offering him more of the antidote he had prepared from traditional indigenous methods. "Even after everything you've done, my grandmother's teachings tell me to heal rather than harm." The act of mercy in the face of such injustice moved everyone present, but Holmes understood its deeper significance. "Mr. Morse, your grandmother's wisdom provides the real solution to this case. Indigenous knowledge shared freely in service of healing, rather than stolen for profit and destruction." Professor Vasquez, her strength returning with the antidote's effects, managed to stand and address the assembled officials. "I propose that all specimens in Professor Pemberton's collection be returned to their communities of origin, along with complete documentation of how they were obtained. Let this case become a precedent for justice rather than exploitation." Sterling made one final attempt to assert government authority. "That collection represents millions of pounds in research investment. You can't simply give it away." "Investment in theft," Holmes replied coldly, "creates no legitimate claim to ownership. The specimens will be returned, Mr. Sterling, and the documentation Agent Morrison has provided will ensure that similar operations are exposed internationally." As the fog began to clear with the approaching dawn, the full scope of their achievement became visible. Mr. Blackwood was taken into custody for murder, while Sterling and his remaining supporters found themselves under investigation by their own colleagues who had been horrified by the evening's revelations. Dr. Whitfield emerged from the fog, having successfully deposited copies of all incriminating documents with journalists at 3 major London newspapers. "The story will be public by afternoon," he announced. "Every detail of Operation Botanica, every stolen specimen, every murdered researcher." Mrs. Pemberton made her own crucial decision. "I'm donating the entire collection to an international committee for repatriation to indigenous communities. And I'm establishing a fund to support traditional healers whose knowledge has been stolen." Holmes watched these proceedings with deep satisfaction. Justice in this case couldn't be achieved through simple arrests and trials. It required a fundamental change in how the world approached indigenous knowledge and cultural heritage. Timothy Morse looked at the assembled group with something approaching wonder. "My grandmother always said that truth has its own power, that justice delayed is not justice denied if the right people are willing to fight for it." Your grandmother was a wise woman, Holmes replied, and her wisdom has helped us solve not just a murder, but expose a systematic crime against humanity itself. As the sun broke through the last of the fog, Holmes reflected on the complexity of the case. The mysterious petal that had started their investigation, a symbol of life and cultural heritage, had indeed revealed everything, just as Timothy's grandmother might have predicted. The case of Professor Pemberton's murder had become something larger, a statement that no amount of official authority could justify the theft of indigenous wisdom or the murder of those who tried to protect it. And there you have it, one of the most complex cases in Sherlock Holmes's career, where justice required not just brilliant deduction, but moral courage from ordinary people willing to stand up to power. If you want to see more investigations that challenge everything you think you know about crime and justice, make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell. Because truth, as we've learned today, really does have its own power, especially when people like you are willing to seek it out. What did you think of this case? Let me know in the comments which part surprised you most, and suggest the next mystery you'd like to see solved.